I turned 80 that morning, with a cake already cut and plates still clean, which told me everything before the clock struck noon. I woke early, the way I always do now, with the light barely touching the edge of the curtains. My knees complained when I sat up, but that was nothing new. I washed my face, pinned my hair, and put on the blue sweater my daughter once said made me look presentable. I remember the word because it stung a little, even then. Presentable for what? I never knew. For being seen, perhaps. The house smelled of vanilla and coffee. I had baked the cake the night before. Steady hands, no rush. 80 years earns you that. I set it on the table, centered, careful. I laid out 4 plates, then added 2 more. I told myself it was practical. You never know who might come with whom. That was my first lie of the day. I checked my phone at 8. Nothing. Again at 9. Still nothing. I told myself people my age should not hover over screens. I went outside and watered the hydrangeas instead, even though they did not need it. The morning was quiet. Too quiet for a birthday, I thought, and then corrected myself. Birthdays are only loud if someone remembers. By 10, I had reheated the coffee twice. I moved the cake knife an inch to the left, then back again. At 11, I sat down and forced myself to eat a slice of toast. My doctor says I forget meals when I'm anxious. I suppose that means I was anxious, though I would not have used that word then. I would have said I was waiting. At noon, I allowed myself 1 call. Just 1. I did not want to sound needy. I left a message that was light, almost cheerful. Just checking in, I said, as if this were any other day. As if I had not been alive for 8 decades, most of them spent answering other people's calls. The afternoon stretched thin. The sun moved across the living room floor, and I followed it with my eyes like a slow animal. I thought of all the birthdays before this one. The noisy ones when the children were small. The quieter ones after my husband died, when a single bouquet and a short dinner felt sufficient. I had never needed much. I only needed to be remembered. By 3, the cake began to sweat under its cover. I took the plastic wrap off, then put it back on again. My hands kept busy because my thoughts would not. I told myself they were busy. I told myself traffic was bad. I told myself someone would walk through the door any minute and laugh, say they were sorry, say life had gotten away from them. I had said those words myself often enough to believe them. At 5, the light faded. That was when it settled in. Not sharply, not like a blow, more like cold. A quiet understanding that nothing else was coming. No knock, no ring, no footsteps on the porch. I did not cry. That surprises people when I tell them later. They expect tears, but tears are for sudden things. This was not sudden. This was the slow conclusion of a pattern I had been pretending not to see. I wrapped the cake carefully and put it in the refrigerator. I washed the unused plates and stacked them back in the cupboard. The house returned to its usual state, as if the day had never asked for more. Before bed, I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. 80 years looked back at me. Not weak, not confused, just tired of waiting. That night, I slept deeply. And when I woke the next morning, I knew something had shifted. Not in them, in me. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the way most important mornings do. I woke at my usual hour, confused for a brief moment by the calm in my chest. Then I remembered. 80 had come and gone, and the house had stayed empty. The memory did not hurt the way I expected. It sat there, solid and quiet, like a fact that had finally stopped arguing with me. I made coffee and did not bother with the good cup. There was no occasion now. The cake waited in the refrigerator, its edges already drying. 80 written in careful frosting that suddenly looked childish. I cut another slice and ate it standing up, not because I was sad, but because sitting felt unnecessary. I have learned, with age, to notice such things. When you stop sitting, it means you are done lingering. My phone lay where I had left it. No missed calls, no messages that began with apologies or excuses. I did not check it again after that. There was nothing left to confirm. I spent the morning doing ordinary things with unusual attention. I folded laundry slowly. I wiped the kitchen counters twice. I opened the windows even though the air was cool. It felt important to let the house breathe, as if it too had been holding something in. Around noon, a message finally arrived. 2 lines. Polite. Late. It said they hoped I'd had a nice day and that things had been hectic. No question. No acknowledgement. I stared at the screen long enough to recognize the pattern and short enough not to fall into it again. I did not reply. Instead, I went to the hallway closet and pulled out a box I had not opened in years. It held papers, manuals, warranties, the dull evidence of a life lived carefully. Beneath them were photographs I no longer displayed. Faces smiling at birthdays I remembered organizing myself. Tables I had set. Candles I had lit for other people. I realized then that the sadness I had expected was not what I felt. What I felt was clarity, clear as a winter morning, clear enough to make decisions without consulting anyone else's comfort. By afternoon, the idea had formed fully. I would sell what I did not need, not quietly, not apologetically, openly. I would let the house empty itself of objects waiting for hands that never came. I would stop preserving things for a future that clearly did not include me. I wrote a simple sign, estate sale. Nothing dramatic, just honest. I taped it to the front window and felt my shoulders relax as if I had set something heavy down. That evening, I reheated soup and ate at the table alone. Not waiting, just eating. Outside, the street was quiet, the same quiet that had greeted my birthday. But it no longer felt personal. Silence, I was beginning to understand, is not rejection. Sometimes it is permission. Before bed, I took the cake out one last time and wrapped the rest tightly. I would give it away tomorrow. No point letting sweetness spoil. I turned off the light and lay down, my body tired, but my mind steady. They had missed my birthday. That was true. But I had not missed myself. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. By the 3rd day, the messages changed in tone, as if someone had adjusted a dial without asking my permission. They were still short, but no longer polite. Questions appeared. Why was there a sign in my window? Who told me to do that? Was everything all right with me? I noticed how quickly concern arrived once control felt threatened. I did not answer. Silence, I had learned, speaks clearly enough. I spent that morning opening drawers I had avoided for years, not because they were painful, but because they were final. Inside were things kept just in case. Extra tablecloths. Candles still wrapped in tissue. Gifts I had bought early, waiting for the right moment that never came. I lined them up on the dining table and saw my life laid out not in memories, but in preparations that had gone unused. Around midday, a neighbor stopped by. She had seen the sign and wanted to know if I was moving. I told her no, just clearing. She looked relieved, then curious. People often are. when they realize you are changing, but not disappearing. She bought a small lamp and stayed to talk longer than necessary. When she left, the house felt warmer than it had in days. That afternoon, my phone rang. I let it ring. Then again, I watched it as one watches weather through a window, aware but unaffected. Eventually, a voice message arrived. This one was sharper. It asked if I was feeling well, suggested maybe I should slow down, maybe I was overwhelmed. The words were careful, but the meaning was not. They were not worried about me. They were worried about what I might do next. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the message twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be sure. Yes. That was the tone I had known for years, the one that dressed control up as care. I deleted the message. In the quiet that followed, I realized something important. I was not angry. Anger requires energy. I felt something steadier. Resolve, perhaps. Or acceptance, the kind that does not ask for permission. I took out a notebook and began to write a list. Not of things to sell, but of things to keep. It was a shorter list. A chair by the window, my husband's watch, a photograph from a summer when we were all younger and still honest with one another. Everything else was negotiable. Later, I sorted through paperwork. Deeds, manuals, insurance policies. I noticed how often my name appeared beside others, how rarely it stood alone. I had built my life around inclusion, around making space. It had not been returned in kind. That evening, I opened a bottle of water and sat on the porch. Cars passed. Lights came on in other houses. Life went on, indifferent and reliable. No one knocked. No one asked me to stop. Before bed, another message arrived. This one was softer again, almost pleading. It mentioned family. It mentioned history. It mentioned what people might say. I read it once and turned the phone face down. People will always say something. At 80, I no longer feel responsible for managing their voices. I lay down that night with a sense of alignment I had not felt in years. The days ahead were uncertain, but they were mine. And for the first time since my birthday, I did not feel forgotten. I felt unseen, no longer necessary. By the fourth morning, the decision no longer felt like a reaction. It felt like a plan. I woke with a list already forming in my head, not written yet, but settled. I moved through the house with purpose, the way I used to when the children were small and needed to be somewhere on time. There is a particular calm that comes with knowing what you are about to do. I had not felt it in years. I started in the living room. The shelves held books I had not opened since my husband died. Not because they hurt, but because they belonged to a version of me that had been quietly retired. I ran my fingers along the spines and pulled out the ones I knew I would never read again. Not everything deserves to be kept just because it once mattered. The cabinets were next. Sets of dishes bought for gatherings that stopped happening. Serving platters I had washed carefully after meals that never happened again. I remembered standing at this same counter years ago, planning menus, calculating portions, always making more than necessary. I had lived my life prepared for abundance that never quite arrived. As I sorted, my phone buzzed again on the kitchen table. I did not look at it. The sound no longer carried urgency. It was just noise, like a distant radio in another room. By late morning, the dining table was full. Not cluttered, just honest. Objects with no future in my hands, waiting for someone else's. I felt no guilt. Guilt is for waste, and this was not waste. This was circulation. I found myself smiling once, unexpectedly, holding a vase someone had given me decades ago. I remembered thanking them too many times, afraid they would think me ungrateful if I stopped. I said it gently with the others. Gratitude, I was learning, does not require lifelong storage. After lunch, I walked through the bedrooms, the guest room especially, always ready, always untouched. Fresh linens folded, pillows plumped for people who never stayed long enough to wrinkle them. I stripped the bed without hesitation. The sheets went into the sale pile. If someone wanted a place in my house, they would have to want me first. In the late afternoon, I sat down to write labels. Simple, clear, no stories attached. I did not want pity purchases. I wanted fair exchange, objects for money, nothing more. When the sun began to lower, I stepped outside and looked at the sign in the window again. Estate sale. The words had not changed, but I had. Yesterday, it had felt defiant. Today, it felt factual. That evening, I received a message I finally read. It asked if I needed help, offered to come by and talk this through. I imagined the conversation clearly enough to know I did not want it. Talking had never changed anything. Action had. I replied with one sentence. I said I was fine and busy. Both were true. Before bed, I stood in the doorway of the living room and took it in. The space looked different already. Lighter, less expectant. I felt a quiet pride, not in what I had built, but in what I was willing to let go. 80 years teaches you this, if you listen. Holding on is easy. Choosing is harder. And that night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without bracing myself for disappointment. By the 5th day, the house no longer felt like a shrine. It felt like a place where something was finally happening. I woke with a dull ache in my lower back, the honest price of bending and lifting the day before. I welcomed it. Pain earned from movement has always felt cleaner to me than pain earned from waiting. I stretched slowly, boiled water for tea, and stood at the kitchen window while it steeped. The street looked the same as ever, but I did not. I could feel it in the way my shoulders settled, no longer pulled upward by expectation. I began in the hallway with the small things people never notice until they are gone. Umbrellas, scarves, a bowl for keys that had held nothing but air for years. Each object had once served a purpose. I thanked them silently and moved on. At my age, you learn that gratitude does not require ceremony. Mid-morning brought a moment I had not anticipated. I opened a drawer in the sideboard and found birthday cards. Not recent ones. Old ones. Handwritten. Crooked letters from small hands. Messages that said things like, "Best mom ever," and "We love you forever." I sat down then. Not because I was weak, but because standing felt inappropriate. I read them carefully, without rushing. I did not romanticize them. Children mean what they say in the moment. Adults mean something else. I folded the cards back into the drawer and closed it. Some truths do not cancel others. They simply replace them. The phone rang again around noon. I let it ring through. A second call followed. Then a message. I recognized the pattern now as clearly as I once recognized hunger in a crying child. Escalation. I was not tempted to engage. The more insistent the tone became, the less room there was for me inside it. In the afternoon, I moved into the garage. That was harder. Boxes labeled in my handwriting from decades ago. Tax papers long past relevance. Tools I never learned to use after my husband died. I held his old work gloves for a moment longer than necessary. They still smelled faintly of oil and soap. I kept them. Some things stay. As the sun shifted, I carried boxes toward the living room, stacking them neatly. Not chaotic, intentional. This was not a purge, it was an edit. A neighbor walked by and waved through the window. I waved back, surprised at how natural it felt. I realized I had been hiding for years without knowing it. Hiding behind politeness, behind patience, behind the belief that waiting was the same as loving. By early evening, the house looked sparse in places and fuller in others. Honest, again. I made myself a simple dinner and ate without distraction. I did not check the phone. I did not wonder who might be upset. That was no longer my work. Before bed, I wrote another list. Not of items this time, but of boundaries. Short, clear. I did not need to show it to anyone. Writing it was enough. When I turned out the light, I felt tired in a way that promised rest. The kind of tired that comes after doing something that cannot be undone and should not be. The first strangers arrived just after 9 the next morning, earlier than I expected. I was still adjusting the placement of things when I heard the soft crunch of tires on the gravel. For a moment, my body reacted the old way, a tightening, the reflex to prepare myself, to explain, to justify. Then I reminded myself that these people owed me nothing, and I owed them nothing beyond honesty. I opened the door and stepped back. 2 women stood on the porch, not young, not old, holding coffee cups and scanning the sign as if it might change its mind. I greeted them plainly. No apology, no explanation. They smiled with the polite curiosity of people entering a stranger's space without entitlement. They moved slowly through the living room, touching nothing at first. One of them asked how long I'd lived here. I told her the truth. A long time. She nodded, as if that explained the quality of the air. By 10, the house was no longer quiet. Not loud either, just alive. Footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing with care. People asking prices and then, unexpectedly, asking questions. Who chose this chair? Did this table come with the house? Where did the lamp come from? I answered simply. I did not dramatize. I did not shrink myself into anecdotes designed to charm. I spoke the way one speaks when there is nothing left to prove. A young couple lingered in the dining room, arguing gently over a set of mismatched plates. They reminded me of a version of life that still believed time was abundant. I watched them smile at each other and felt no envy, only recognition. Around midday, a man asked about a bookshelf I had built with my husband decades ago. I told him that too. He listened, really listened, and then said it must have held many good books. I said it had held enough. He paid without haggling. I noticed then how different this felt from family gatherings. No one rushed me. No one checked their phone while I spoke. No one looked past me to see what else they might take. These strangers saw me clearly because they had no history to edit. My phone buzzed in my pocket more than once. I ignored it. The house deserved my attention more than the past did. In the afternoon, a woman about my daughter's age held up a picture frame and asked if the photo inside was for sale too. I told her no. Some things stay. She nodded, understanding without asking why. By the time the sun began to lower, several rooms looked thinner, not empty, just relieved. Money sat neatly in an envelope on the counter, lighter than expected, heavier in meaning. When the last person left, I locked the door and leaned against it for a moment. Not from exhaustion, from something closer to satisfaction. The house was quieter again, but it was a different quiet than before. It no longer waited. Neither did I. By the 7th day, I noticed I was no longer bracing myself before opening my mouth. The conversations came easily now. People asked, I answered. Sometimes they lingered, not because they wanted something cheaper, but because they wanted to talk. There is a difference, and at 80 you can hear it immediately. One is sharp and impatient, the other settles in. A man with paint on his hands spent nearly half an hour looking through old records with me. He told me about restoring houses, about how walls remember things even when people pretend they don't. I believed him. When he left with a small stack of vinyls, he thanked me as if I'd given him more than music. A woman my age bought a teapot and asked if I minded her sitting for a moment. We drank water at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important. That is how you know something is important. She told me she had stopped hosting holidays years ago and had never regretted it. I did not tell her why I was selling my things. I did not need to. She saw enough. Between visitors, I walked through the rooms and noticed how differently I occupied them. I stood in doorways without hesitation. I sat where I wanted. I did not worry about whether someone might need the space later. The house belonged to the present now, not a hoped-for future. My phone buzzed again in the late afternoon. I checked it this time, not with anticipation, but with curiosity. The messages had shifted. Fewer questions, more irritation. Words like concerned and confused appeared again, but the edges were sharper now. They were realizing that something had moved without their consent. I set the phone down and returned to a conversation with a woman who was buying a side table. She asked how I knew when it was time to let things go. I told her the truth. You know when keeping them starts to cost more than releasing them. As the day went on, I noticed something else. I was being seen, not evaluated, not managed, simply seen. These strangers did not know my role, my history, my usefulness. They met me as I was, and that was enough. By evening, I felt a pleasant tiredness settle into my bones, the kind that comes after meaningful effort, not emotional negotiation. I counted the money once, then put it away. I was not selling my life. I was redistributing its weight. After the last car pulled away, I sat alone in the living room. The air felt lighter, not empty, honest. I realized then that I had not once thought about my birthday that day. Not the cake, not the silence, not the waiting. That surprised me. I turned off the lamp and went to bed without checking my phone again. For years, I had stayed awake listening for other people's needs. That night, I listened only to my own breathing, steady and unafraid. By the 8th day, I understood something I had avoided admitting for years. I had been lonely long before my birthday. The realization came quietly, the way real truths do. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that no longer needed wiping, when it settled in. The loneliness had not begun with forgotten dates or unanswered calls. It had begun when conversations became transactional, when visits carried expectations, when my presence mattered only as long as it was useful. That afternoon, fewer people came. The rush had passed. Those who arrived moved more slowly, like me. One man wandered from room to room without asking prices at all. When I finally asked if he was looking for something specific, he smiled and said no. He just liked houses that felt lived in. I knew exactly what he meant. We talked for a while. He told me about losing his wife and how quiet his evenings had become. I did not offer comfort. I offered company. there is a difference. When he left, he took nothing with him, but he shook my hand with both of his. It mattered. Later, a woman stood in front of a bookshelf I had decided not to sell. She asked why those books were staying when so many others were going. I told her some stories are not finished just because you stop reading them. She nodded, as if she had been waiting to hear that. Between visitors, I found myself thinking less about my family and more about myself. Not in a selfish way, in a curious one. What did I want now, at 80, without anyone else's schedule wrapped around my decisions? The question felt unfamiliar, but not frightening. My phone rang once in the late afternoon. I did not answer. A message followed, sharper than the ones before. It asked what I thought I was doing. I smiled at the phrasing, as if my life were still an extension of someone else's. I turned the phone face down and continued pricing a set of glasses. They caught the light and scattered it across the wall in small, deliberate patterns. I watched them for a moment longer than necessary. I had spent so many years focusing on what others needed that I had forgotten the pleasure of noticing small things simply because they were there. As evening approached, I sat on the floor of the living room, my back against the couch, something I would not have done a week ago. The room felt larger now, not emptier, just no longer crowded with expectations. I thought again about my birthday, about the silence. And for the first time, I did not frame it as abandonment. I framed it as information. Clear, undeniable information about where I stood and where I no longer needed to stand. That night, before bed, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked older than I remembered and steadier than I expected. Loneliness, I realized, does not disappear when people arrive. It disappears when you stop disappearing yourself. I turned off the lights and went to sleep, not waiting for anything. By the 9th day, the phone calls stopped pretending. They did not open with concern anymore. They opened with irritation, thinly veiled and poorly managed. I knew the tone well. I had heard it before when I declined to do favors that were never framed as favors. When I asked for time, when I hesitated instead of agreeing immediately. This time, I did not hesitate at all. The message that finally made me pick up the phone was not long. It did not ask how I was. It asked what I thought I was doing with the house and why I hadn't discussed it first. The phrasing was revealing. Not my house. The house, as if ownership had quietly shifted while I wasn't looking. I listened to the voicemail once, calmly, the way one listens to a weather report. I noticed how my name was used only once and only at the end, softened slightly, like an afterthought. I deleted it without ceremony. That afternoon, I locked the front door for an hour and made myself soup. I ate slowly at the table, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the time pass without interruption. I realized then how often my meals had been rushed, eaten between obligations that were never officially mine. Even hunger had learned to wait its turn. When I unlocked the door again, a man and his teenage daughter were waiting. They apologized for arriving early, though they were not. She wandered through the living room with the careful curiosity of someone who had been taught to respect other people's spaces. She picked up a small wooden box and asked who it had belonged to. I told her it had been mine, and that surprised her enough to make her smile. They bought very little. That was fine. When they left, the girl turned back and thanked me for letting her look around. Not buy. Look. It struck me how rare that had become. Late in the day, another message arrived. This one was longer. It explained that I was being impulsive, that people were worried, that I should slow down, and think about the future. The future, apparently, had an address that was not mine. I set the phone down and walked through the house. The rooms no longer echoed with imagined footsteps. They felt settled, as if relieved to stop hosting expectations that never materialized. I stood in the doorway of the guest room and understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that this space had never been for guests. It had been for hope. And hope, when left unused too long, turns heavy. As evening came, I sat on the porch and watched the street change colors with the light. A week ago, I would have been watching my phone instead, waiting for someone else to decide I mattered. Now, the quiet felt earned. They would come eventually. I knew that. Not to ask how I was, but to ask what I was doing. And for the first time, I was ready to answer honestly, not with explanations, with boundaries. The thought did not frighten me. It steadied me. They came on the 10th day just after lunch, without calling first. I saw the car before I heard the knock. Familiar shape, familiar hesitation as it pulled up too close to the curb, then corrected itself. I did not rush to the door. I finished rinsing my cup, dried my hands, and walked slowly, the way I do now. If someone wants to confront you, they can wait the length of a hallway. When I opened the door, they stood there with practiced expressions. Concern on the surface, irritation just beneath it. They asked how I was doing as if it were a formality required before moving on to the real business. I answered truthfully. I said I was fine. That seemed to disappoint them. They stepped inside without waiting to be invited, eyes already scanning the room. I noticed what they noticed first. The space, the absence, the missing furniture. It was not me they were assessing. It was the inventory. The questions came quickly after that. Why was I selling things? Who told me this was a good idea? Had I spoken to anyone about it? Each question assumed the same thing, that I could not possibly have arrived here on my own. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was intimidated, but because I wanted to hear how far they would go if I let them. They spoke about responsibility, about family, about what people might think. They did not speak about my birthday. They did not speak about the silence. Those details, apparently, were no longer relevant. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. It was steady, not defensive. I said I was clearing space. I said I was tired of keeping things for people who did not come. I said I liked the way the house felt now. Lighter. Honest. They exchanged looks. That old reflex. The silent agreement that I was being difficult. One of them said I was overreacting. Another said I was being dramatic. I noted how easily my clarity became their inconvenience. I told them no one had forgotten by accident. I said that forgetting is a habit, not a mistake. The room went quiet then, not with shock, but with discomfort. Truth has that effect when it removes excuses. They reminded me of everything they had done over the years, though none of it involved asking how I was when they did not need something. I let them finish. Then I said something I had never said before. I said that care is not proven by history, but by presence. And presence, I added, does not require reminders. The conversation did not end well. It did not end badly, either. It ended clearly. They left with frustration still clinging to them, with promises to talk later, with warnings dressed as concern. I closed the door gently behind them. I stood in the quiet for a long moment afterward, waiting to see if guilt would arrive the way it always used to. It did not. What arrived instead was relief. That evening, I made myself dinner and ate at the table with the window open. The house held the silence without tension now. I realized then that confrontation does not always resolve things. Sometimes it simply confirms what you already know. And that night, for the first time, I did not rehearse the conversation again in my head. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was no longer mine to carry. By the 11th day, I felt the weight of words I had never spoken fully settle in my chest. It was mid-morning when I finally sat down in the living room with the envelopes of money from the previous sales stacked neatly on the side table. I had spent the past few days watching strangers move through the house, listening, answering questions, and witnessing interest without judgment or expectation. It had been a strange comfort, this attention without history. And yet, the house still hummed with the echoes of those who had not come. I thought of the birthdays, the holidays, the meals that had never happened, the quiet mornings when my calls went unanswered and my presence seemed invisible. I remembered each small act of generosity, each loan and favor extended, each time I had adjusted myself to the needs and desires of others while keeping my own quietly in check. And then I thought of the messages and calls that had begun to trickle in over the past few days, thinly veiled interrogations, veiled admonishments, the polite tones with sharp edges. They had finally realized that I was moving, not waiting. I poured myself a cup of tea and held it in both hands. The warmth seeped into my palms, and I felt steadier than I had in years. For so long, I had measured myself against the expectations of others. I had measured my value in responsiveness, in generosity, in patience. But now, for the first time, I measured myself against nothing. There was no one here demanding proof of my worth. There was only me, and the choices I was willing to make. I opened the first envelope and counted the money again. The sum was modest compared to the life I had built, but it was enough. More than enough. I smiled at the thought that I could choose to use it for myself, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else's comfort or approval. It was a small rebellion, quiet and firm. A reminder that I still had agency, even at 80. Midday brought another knock at the door. A man, a stranger, with careful shoes and a calm demeanor. He asked to see the furniture I had set aside for display, not for sale. He listened when I spoke about its history, about why I had kept it, and nodded as if understanding without comment. He paid attention in a way my children had not, in a way no one had for years. I realized then that being noticed does not always come from being needed. Sometimes it comes from being acknowledged. The afternoon stretched lazily. I moved through the house, rearranging a few items for the day's visitors, straightening a picture frame, adjusting a small lamp. The rooms no longer felt like waiting rooms. They felt lived in, even for someone who had never entered before. I passed the guest room and stopped, remembering the empty bed with the plump pillows that had never been slept in. I smiled at it now, not with regret, but with understanding. Some places are meant for memory, not occupancy. By evening, the last visitors had left. The envelopes were still stacked neatly on the table. The house had returned to quiet, but it was a different quiet, not empty, not expectant, not oppressive, just quiet. I sat in the chair by the window, tea in hand, and looked out at the fading light. The street was still. The trees swayed slightly. The world moved on, indifferent, and yet I felt aligned within it in a way I had not in decades. I thought of the conversations I had avoided, the truths I had not voiced, and the silence I had endured. I realized that speaking had changed nothing about what had happened, but it had changed everything about me. The weight of years of unspoken words had lifted, leaving space to breathe, to move, and to exist on my own terms. That night, I placed the envelopes by the side table and went to bed early. I did not feel anxious. I did not feel lonely. I felt deliberate. I felt seen, not because anyone had chosen to see me, but because I had chosen to see myself. For the first time in years, that alone was enough. By the 12th day, the first of my relatives arrived at the house. I had expected it eventually, though not with any anticipation. They parked carefully in the driveway, stepping lightly onto the porch as if they were walking through a museum rather than the place I had lived and organized for decades. I greeted them without ceremony, no smile, no apology. I opened the door, letting them in, and they stepped over the threshold as if it belonged to them by right. I did not correct them. I did not have to. The house had already taught them its rules by being open but not accommodating. They began their inspection immediately, commenting on what was gone, what remained, and the arrangements that had been left for display. Their voices carried the weight of expectation, but also something new, a cautious recognition that they were not in complete control. I let them speak. I listened without nodding, without defending, without explaining. My presence alone was enough statement. Questions came, sharp and unpracticed. Who had decided this sale? Why hadn't they been consulted? Had I considered the consequences? I answered calmly, telling them that the decision had been mine and mine alone, that consequences are inherent in choices, and that consulting them would have been unnecessary. I saw the irritation flare, small and quick, and I let it be. I did not step back. I did not soften my tone. As they moved through the rooms, their eyes lingered on spaces they had long ignored. The dining room, stripped of excess, felt larger than they remembered. The living room, with its new arrangement, felt deliberate, intentional. The weight of years of ignoring my presence and efforts hovered in the air, palpable to anyone who had been accustomed to taking my labor for granted. I did not speak of it. I did not need to. The silence said enough. One of them finally asked about the envelopes of money from the previous sales. I told them it was arranged, handled, and none of their business. That answer brought a thin silence. The room felt heavier for it, but I felt lighter. I realized that for years I had carried both my possessions and the responsibility of managing other people's responses to them. That responsibility had been lifted, and the relief was palpable in my own body. They lingered longer than expected, inspecting, questioning, testing boundaries. But the house had already shifted its allegiance. It was no longer an extension of their needs, desires, or sense of propriety. It was mine, governed by the rules I had silently enforced through the days of the sale. Each piece sold, each object kept, and each moment I stood my ground reinforced the reality that the house now reflected my authority, not theirs. By evening, they had left, muttering behind them, attempting to assert control that no longer existed. I closed the door, locked it, and stood for a long moment listening to the quiet that had returned. This was no ordinary quiet. It was the kind that allows breathing, reflection, and the recognition of one's own space without intrusion. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching a chair here, a table there, observing the light fall across the walls. For the first time in many years, I moved freely, unburdened by obligation, judgment, or expectation. I realized that authority over one's life and home is not granted. It is taken, gently but firmly, with patience, consistency, and clarity. That night, I went to bed feeling the solidity of my choices settle in my chest. I had faced the confrontation without defense, without retreat, and without apology. I understood that respect is not demanded, it is earned through consistent action, even if those who should have known it are slow to see. For the first time, I felt aligned. My space, my life, and my presence were my own, and that alone carried a satisfaction deeper than any celebration I had once hoped for. By the 13th day, the decision I had been postponing for years was finally clear in my mind. I spent the morning in the office, reviewing papers I had long avoided. Wills, deeds, account statements, and notes from lawyers sat in neat piles. I had always left these matters to others, trusting that family would act with care and respect. Now I understood that trust had been misplaced. The people who should have protected my interests had forgotten the first rule of family, that respect is given, not assumed. I picked up a pen and began drafting changes, not hurriedly, but deliberately. Every word mattered, each clause carefully considered. I included provisions that protected what remained mine and clarified that control of my affairs rested solely with me. I thought about the past, the years I had tried to please, the countless loans and favors, the quiet sacrifices that had been invisible or ignored. None of that would dictate the future anymore. By midday, the documents were in order. I reviewed them again, checking every line, every condition, until I was satisfied. The legal papers became more than contracts. They became statements of autonomy. I realized that for decades, I had deferred to others' assumptions of authority over my life. Now, authority was mine and mine alone. I did not rush to inform anyone. There was no need for dramatics. I would not announce a change meant to protect me. Those who needed to know would find out when it became necessary. In the meantime, I allowed myself the quiet pleasure of knowing that the house, the possessions, and the arrangements reflected my choices and my priorities. The afternoon brought a moment of reflection. I walked through each room, noting what had been sold, what remained, and what I had kept simply for myself. A chair by the window, a small desk, a photograph of my husband and me from a summer long past. Nothing extravagant, but everything meaningful. I understood that the measure of a life is not what you give to others, but what you preserve for yourself. Evening fell, and with it a calm I had not felt in years. I sat at the table with a cup of tea, reviewing the documents once more. Each decision, each clause, reaffirmed my independence. I thought of the family who had tried to assert control, of the messages that had arrived over the past days, of the confusion and thinly veiled irritation. None of that mattered. I was no longer reacting. I was acting. Night came, and I turned off the lights, leaving the documents in order on the desk. I lay down in bed and felt a quiet satisfaction settle into my bones. For the first time in decades, I knew that I had acted for myself. That alone was enough. Respect, it seemed, could be reclaimed without confrontation, without anger, without waiting for recognition. It could be claimed quietly, decisively, and with clarity. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of my breathing. The house was quiet, the world outside indifferent, and inside me, a sense of authority, of self-possession, of dignity, filled the spaces that had once been occupied by doubt and anticipation. I had chosen my path, and I would walk it without hesitation. The decision was mine, and that realization carried a freedom stronger than any apology or acknowledgement I had ever sought. By the 14th day, the house was almost empty, but the air felt lighter than it had in years. I walked through the rooms, touching surfaces I had never noticed before. The walls seemed to breathe. The light settled differently on the floors, and I realized that the absence of expectation made the space feel alive in a way it had never been when it was crowded with obligations, unspoken rules, and the weight of polite pretense. I moved slowly through each room, observing the furniture I had kept and the objects I had sold. Everything that remained was chosen deliberately, not by default. A small table by the window, a chair near the bookshelf, photographs framed with care. I understood then that what remains after removal is more important than what is gone. It is what you decide to preserve, what you consider essential, that defines the space and, in a way, defines you. The envelopes of money from the estate sale sat on the side table, stacked neatly, untouched. I had counted them, recorded them, and set them aside without thinking of the people who would have wanted access to them. That was deliberate. My attention no longer belonged to others. My resources, my time, my energy, all belonged to me. It was a subtle but profound shift, and I felt it in my chest. As evening approached, the quiet settled in differently, not as absence, not as emptiness, but as presence. Presence of choice, presence of clarity, presence of a life managed by my own hand. The windows reflected the fading light, and I noticed the way the house had become a mirror of me. It was deliberate, intentional, and steady. I moved through it with a calm I had not known for decades. I sat in my favorite chair and looked at the remaining objects with care. Each piece told a story, not of sacrifice or obligation, but of life lived fully and decisions made clearly. The photographs reminded me of love and connection that had been genuine, even when it had been rare. The furniture reminded me of years of labor and attention that had always been mine to shape, though it had often been claimed by others. Now it was mine in every sense. I poured a cup of tea and held it in my hands, savoring the warmth. There was no hurry. No one would interrupt. No one would judge. The day had been completed on my terms, not theirs. For the first time, I recognized that independence is not simply a matter of money or possessions. It is a matter of claiming your own space, your own time, and your own voice, and refusing to surrender them quietly to anyone else. Night fell, and the house grew still. I moved through the rooms one last time before bed, ensuring everything was in its place. Nothing remained out of habit. Nothing remained as a favor or a statement to anyone else. Everything was exactly as I had chosen. I realized that in the act of letting go, I had created a kind of peace that had nothing to do with absence and everything to do with presence. I went to bed that night with the sense that the house, the objects, and the quiet had aligned with me. For the first time in many years, I felt that my life was reflected in my surroundings, unmediated by anyone else's expectations or judgments. I slept deeply, knowing that what had been lost was not my life, but the illusions that had kept me small, and what remained was mine, fully and unequivocally. By the 15th day, the house no longer felt like the setting of a story. It felt like the conclusion. I woke late that morning, later than usual, and did not correct myself. There was no schedule waiting to be honored. No one expecting me to explain where my time had gone. The light filtered softly through the curtains, touching the walls I had chosen to keep bare. Everything felt intentional now, including the quiet. I made coffee and sat at the table, not across from anyone, not angled toward a phone, just there. I thought about my birthday again, but differently, not as a wound, as a marker. The moment I stopped waiting for people to show up and started showing up for myself. That shift had changed more than the house. It had changed how I carried my years. The estate sale was over. The sign was gone. What remained was not loss, but alignment. I had kept what mattered and released what did not. Objects, expectations, roles that no longer fit the shape of my life. At 80, you learn that dignity does not announce itself. It settles quietly when you stop negotiating your worth. I took out the documents one last time and placed them neatly in the drawer. Everything was clear now. There would be no confusion later, no assumptions dressed up as love. I had done what needed to be done without anger, without spectacle. That mattered to me. Strength does not require noise. In the afternoon, I walked through the house slowly. The chair by the window, the small table, the photograph that still made me smile without pulling me backward. I noticed how steady my steps felt. Not hurried, not hesitant. Just sure. No one came that day. No knocks. No calls. And I did not feel abandoned by it. I felt finished. There is a difference, and it takes a lifetime to learn it. That evening, I sat by the window as the sky dimmed and thought about all the years I had mistaken patience for love and endurance for loyalty. I had been generous. I had been kind. But I had also been quiet when I should have been clear. I do not regret my kindness. I regret only the silence that followed it. If you are reading this and you recognize yourself in these rooms, in this waiting, in this quiet adjustment of your life around other people's comfort, I want you to know something. It is not too late. Not at 50. Not at 60. Not at 80. You are allowed to choose yourself without apologizing. You are allowed to stop preserving space for people who do not come. I turned off the light and went to bed with a calm that did not ask for approval. The house held me the way it always had, but now it did so on my terms. And if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of something you have been carrying alone, share it. Leave a word. Let another woman know she is not imagining it. Silence ends the moment one of us decides to speak.